Hi, everyone. We're just waiting for people to come in and we will start in about 2 minutes. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's virtual conference series session. My name is Anna Levy, and I'm going to be moderating today's talk. Today's talk will be given by Dr. Steinbeis, followed by a research pitch from Dean Slattery. Just a reminder that the next talk will be on July 28th, Socioeconomic Inequality and Children's Brain Development by Kim Noble. Lastly, we look forward to seeing you all in person next summer at the 7th Biennial IMBES Conference in Montreal. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Steinbeis, who is a professor at the University College of London. His research focuses on the malleability of cognitive control in childhood. Today, we will be hearing more about this with his talk, Opportunities and Limits of Cognitive Control Plasticity in Childhood. There will be an opportunity to ask questions after the talk, so please hold your questions until the end. Without further ado, Dr. Steinbeis, you can share your screen and get started.
Okay, can you see my screen? Yep, brilliant. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present my recent and ongoing work to you today. It's a huge honor and privilege to be able to speak, and very much looking forward to it. And I also thought it was a brilliant idea to leverage these opportunities of remote presentation in the times of the pandemic, even though, of course, it would have been lovely to see all of you in person. So today I'll be presenting on opportunities and limits of cognitive control plasticity in childhood. I'm sort of gradually going to work my way forward towards this. But before doing so, I just want to talk a little bit more broadly about the research brief of my lab. So the name of my research outfit at UCL is the Developmental Change and Plasticity Lab. And we're sort of very broadly interested in studying how exactly developmental change unfolds. And in the context of this, we're particularly interested in specific phenomena, such as trying to understand whether change unfolds qualitatively or quantitatively, if it occurs gradually or suddenly, whether change is continuous or discontinuous. So, really trying to understand and study pretty broad question in terms of developmental change, and plasticity, the other facet and focus of our lab, trying to understand, for instance, the possibility of sensitive periods, particularly with regards to higher order cognitive functions like cognitive control or executive functions, and also topics of transfer. So plasticity, training particular cognitive functions, and seeing whether and how this transfers onto other associated functions. So these are the kind of questions that I try to look at in my lab, and the phenotypes that we look at to do so are pretty broad and mainly to do with social behavior and affective experiences. So we've looked at, for instance, emotional egocentricity. So, our ability to suppress our own emotional experiences to try and understand how someone else feels. In other words, empathy, but in particular, it's sort of tricky situations. We're trying to shed light on the neural mechanisms of theory of mind development, particularly studying brain development, white matter development in 3 to 4-year-old children. We also look at pro-social behaviors, such as sharing and helping. So these are the broad phenotypes that we're interested in trying to understand these broader developmental questions. And one particular theme that's emerged in all of this research is that cognitive control appears to be absolutely central in terms of supporting the development of these higher order social abilities and pro-social behaviors. So in each of these relatively distinct social and affective phenotypes, we've been able to show that some form of cognitive control drives the developmental change that we see in the emergence of these abilities and behaviors. And this is what's really sort of led to a strong focus of my work on cognitive control. So what do we mean by cognitive control? Our daily lives and also non-daily lives, but sort of lives more broadly, are punctuated by trying to attain short-term and long-term goals. And these goals may differ on any given day. They also may differ between each other, so between individuals. So, it might be about losing weight or trying to climb a tall mountain or trying to get some cool work published in a prestigious research outlet. But what having or attaining all these goals has in common is a relatively fundamental skill, which is our ability to keep that goal in mind and to resist temptations on the way of trying to attain those goals. So really that's that is sort of a manifestation of what cognitive control is. In a more formal definition, is that cognitive control supports flexible and adaptive responses to environmental changes in the pursuit of goals. Now, cognitive control has been shown to be important for a range of other domains and real-life outcomes. It accounts for the quality of social relationships. It's very, very tightly correlated with attainment and academic achievement. It's strongly linked to well-being as well as mental and physical health. And given that we're interested in development, most crucially, cognitive control during childhood is a really strong predictor of cognitive control later in life, as well as all of these later life outcomes. So trying to understand cognitive control during childhood is an important endeavor, given its predictive relationships with later life outcomes. So what I'll be talking about today more broadly then is understanding the dynamics of how cognitive control develops. And I do so by looking at plasticity, as well as trying to understand the important role of goals and nature of goals in cognitive control. So the first part of my talk will be on the plasticity of cognitive control, where I will use a training design to try and understand the mechanisms of cognitive control, with a particular focus on inhibition versus monitoring. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. And then talk about a much more broader study on cognitive control intervention, where we try to understand transfer effects and the possible role of sensitive periods in the development of cognitive control. So that's the first part of my talk. And the second part of my talk will be on the role of cognitive control in goal pursuit, or rather the other way around, the importance of goals in shaping cognitive control and how cognitive control is deployed. And I'm going to be presenting one particular study looking at the role of incentives and rewards on how cognitive control is deployed. So on to the first part then, the plasticity of cognitive control. This is obviously a really important question, as I've alluded to, given the importance of cognitive control for later well-being. And to date, cognitive control, it forms a relatively broad cluster of cognitive functions, but working memory, so our ability to keep a goal in mind, is also part of cognitive control. And most of the literature on the plasticity or training of cognitive control has focused on working memory. I think there are particular reasons for it. I won't go into these now, but sort of most of our assumptions, most of our findings and the theories on cognitive control plasticity rest on studies that have looked at working memory trainings. It's very, very limited for other domains, such as inhibition, which I'll be talking about today. And broadly, the findings are very, very mixed. The kind of randomized controlled trials that are being used to compare the effect of training working memory, say, with an active control, have produced very mixed findings. And this is baffling in some regards. So the basic assumption of all of these trainings is that we see an association between our core construct of interest, which we're trying to train, say here working memory, and an outcome variable that we're interested in, which is important for achievement, such as maths or reading or IQ. And what's been shown in the literature, and this is very, very robust finding, is that there are strong associations across the lifespan between working memory abilities and, say, academic achievement or fluid reasoning. So the idea is that if we try and boost working memory, that as a result, we would also be able to boost these associated functions. But this very rarely to never happens. So what we usually see is that when we try and boost one particular type of cognitive control, we see what's called near transfer. So other cognitive functions which are very, very similar will be boosted, but something that's sort of more distally related, such as maths and reading or IQ, won't have see any tangible change. And this is baffling. This is baffling for a range of different reasons, because we know that experiences do generalize in long-lasting ways in natural learning contexts. We also know that the executive functions or cognitive control can be persistently affected by negative events. So why is it so hard to boost this by using a training? And also what's interesting is that the kind of discussions that you have with lay people, but also with sciences, our intuitive experience, our sort of day-to-day experience tells us that particular experiences tend to generalize to different contexts. So what is it that we might be missing? Is it generally that training does not transfer to anything distally related, or is it just that our paradigms aren't really capturing this in the appropriate way? So the question that my work tries to address is whether there is indeed transfer to distally related cognitive functions as a function of cognitive control training, and how durable is this transfer? And one other particular feature that training paradigms can be used for is they can tell us something about the nature of cognitive control. So the first study that I'll be talking about today is using cognitive control trainings to respond to a pretty contentious debate in the cognitive control literature, which is what is the core mechanism of cognitive control? It's obviously important that this kind of a question needs to be addressed first before we start moving towards sort of larger scale interventions of wanting to improve cognitive control in the general population. So I think, it's in a way, it's quite helpful that these types of paradigms also lend themselves to being able to sort of advance a relatively mechanistic research agenda. So in cognitive control, then, there is a debate as to what the sort of fundamental nature of cognitive control actually is. And for a very, very long time, it's been argued that sort of the most important feature of cognitive control is something known as inhibition. It's our ability to inhibit prepotent impulses. So it's all about our ability to inhibit, to stop prepotent impulses. Now, in 2012, a pretty influential paper was published by Chatham and colleagues, arguing that inhibition could be more or entirely about our ability to monitor our environment for cues that signal the necessity to inhibit. So inhibition is effectively just a byproduct of us needing to select between whether we're going to respond or whether we're going to inhibit. There's nothing special about inhibition, and it's ultimately the same kind of process that we apply to monitoring the environment for whether we're meant to be acting as when we're not meant to be acting. And they use a stop signal task, which instantiates this pretty well. So here on the top, you have something called a go trial, where you see a visual stimulus, and all you're meant to do is respond using a button press. And on 25 to 30% of the trials, you have a so-called stop trial, where initially you're presented with a go stimulus, and then after a short delay, you're presented with a stop stimulus, and you're not meant to inhibit. Oh, you're meant to inhibit on those trials. And basically what they argue is that stopping in this particular case, what happens is that given that this happens on a rare number of trials, participants are sort of primed to monitor for so-called stop signals. And what they show is that when you ask participants not to inhibit on these trials, but to respond twice to stop trials, you see a virtually indistinguishable behavioral, psychophysiological, and neural signatures. And what they're arguing is that if this is identical to what you see during inhibition trials, then it can't be about inhibition, but more about our necessity to monitor the environment. Now, training studies offer a really helpful window into understanding these causal relationships of inhibition and context monitoring and how they relate to cognitive control. So what we tried to do in the first study is we trained either inhibition or context monitoring, and we wanted to see whether there are differential effects, whether there are similar effects on other measures of cognitive control. So the null hypothesis is that inhibition and monitoring are effectively indistinguishable. So we ought to see comparable effects on other measures of cognitive control, whereas our working hypothesis is that there might indeed there might be something special about inhibition, which is why we might see sort of differential effects of inhibition training and monitoring training. So we launched this in a slightly smaller scale pilot study, and these are the lovely members of my lab, and I want to emphasize that all the work that I'm presenting today is, a part of an extensive team effort. These are, sort of hugely labor-intensive studies, and I couldn't have done it without the wonderful people that comprise the Developmental Change and Plasticity Lab. So at the very core of these trainings then is the stop signal reaction time task, where participants are presented with a series of events, visual stimuli primarily, and they're asked to respond as fast as they can. And on 25% of the trials, they are also presented with a stop signal on which they're meant to inhibit. Now, one feature which is particularly nice about the stop signal paradigm is that the delay between the go response, between the go signal and the stop signal varies as a function of individual performance. So if it's very, very close together, it's pretty easy to inhibit. And if they're far apart, it's more difficult to inhibit. And the way that this training is delivered is it waxes and wanes perfectly with individual performance on any given trial. So as soon as you inhibit successfully, the gap between the go and the stop signal increases. And if you fail to inhibit, then the gap decreases. So there's a perfect waxing and waning, which is what you want, obviously, from a training study. And it also allowed us to adapt this across multiple sessions. I'm just going to take a sec. So importantly, what we try to do is, that the trainings were meant to go on for a considerable time period. In this case, it was 6 weeks. We wanted to make sure that children were actually engaged in doing this. So we made it very, very gamified, variable, highly adaptive in the way that I explained to you just now, as well as complex and diverse. So what we did was we had an overarching narrative for our participants. Participants were told that they had flown and crashed a plane in the desert. And to fix their plane, they had to find a sage who was able to give them spare parts. To get those spare parts, they needed to collect gems and coins by navigating different worlds. And within these worlds, they were presented with particular challenges, which they had to complete, and where they could win some coins and some gems in exchange. So that was the overarching narrative, and we presented them with sort of 9, 10 different games that sort of occurred in variable contexts, and that children wouldn't get bored during this training. So I'm just going to show you a quick video of what this actually looked like. So here what you have is an icon for our participant, and they can, here is a sort of a visual demonstration of where they are. And then they are sort of shown the next world, and they can choose which cave they want to explore. And here is the first game which they're seeing, a rerun of the instruction. And here you go. So they're meant to press every time they see the rock. And sometimes there's a gem in the rock, and on those trials they're not meant to press at all. I think it's coming up. There you go, exactly. Successful inhibition, and whoops, the gem goes in the bag. There you go. So that's one of the games, and we had several of these, and it's just important that, you know, we kept our participants interested. So we had 3 training groups in this first study. One group of participants were meant to inhibit on the stop signals. The other group of participants had to respond to the go signal, and they had to respond twice to the stop signal. So the sort of you know, increased demands on monitoring, but the monitoring demands between inhibition and context monitoring were identical, but here there's no inhibition required. And then we had a third group which merely trained on response speed, so they were asked to respond as fast as they could on display of the visual stimulus. And before and after the 6-week training, participants were given a stop signal reaction time task and an AX-CPT task, so AX continuous performance task, which allows us to look at cognitive control profiles, namely reactive and proactive control. So we did this with 60 children with a mean age of 8.6 years, divided them into 3 training groups. The duration of training was 6 weeks in total, with 1 session taking place at school and 3 recommended sessions at home, and 1 hour of pre-post testing taking place at school. Now, I'm just going to talk about a little bit of preliminary data on the motivation. So, you know, when we do these kinds of studies, we want to make sure that overall participants trained in the same way and that they were equally motivated. So the average number of sessions completed was 8.6, and there was no difference between the 3 groups. And we asked participants when we came into school to do the training with them over the weeks, how motivated they were. And overall, the motivation was actually relatively high. So it's around 2 out of 3, and it was equal between the 3 groups. So that's sort of a pretty decent place to start off from. Now, we then looked at whether the cognitive function that we wanted to improve actually improved during the process of training. And what we see here on the x-axis is the number of sessions that participants completed. And here we have the SSRT, so sort of, how effective, how efficient the inhibition process was for the inhibition group. And we see a very nice gradual decrease. So their inhibition improved as a function of training, which is what we wanted to see. Here we looked at the response times during the monitoring training. And we also see that our participants improved in their monitoring. And here we saw the response time decrease in the response speed training. So this is really nice because it shows that the functions that we wanted to train were actually trained. And anything from this point onwards, we can just sort of take at face value whether we actually see any transfer at all. So here we're going to look at the near transfer effects, comparing the pre-post of the 3 groups and looking at the SSRT and the AX-CPT. So what we have down here is the SSRT split up pre and post for the 3 groups. The pre-test is in green and the post-test is in blue. And here you have the inhibition and then the context monitoring group and then the response speed group. And we see that the only group which demonstrates a tangible decrease in the SSRT, so improved cognitive control, as it were, was the group training inhibition, but not in the group training context monitoring and not in the group training response speed. And when we look at the stop signal delay, so the delay between the go signal and the stop signal, we also see a significant increase only in the inhibition group, but not in the other 2 groups. And in a way, I think that's not altogether surprising, given that the SSRT is really also at the core of what we're training during the inhibition training. So in a way, that's sort of the nearest transfer that what we could find. But what is interesting is that the context monitoring training didn't actually lead to any changes at all pre-post. Now, what's more interesting is whether there was any sort of meaningful transfer on other measures of cognitive control, for which we use the AXCPT. The AXCPT is a very standard protocol for looking at different cognitive control profiles, namely reactive and proactive control. So participants see two types of cues and two types of probes. The cue in our case was either a dog or a cat, and the probe was an orange or an apple. And participants, each time they see a dog and an orange, they were meant to press a button, and each time they saw a dog or an apple or a cat and either of the fruit, they were meant to inhibit. Now, there's the way that this task is structured is that more trials entail an A and an X, which is why it's sort of called an AXCPT task, entail an A and an X. So we're sort of priming or predisposing participants to that association most often. And proactive control is indexed by an improved performance of BX trials over AY trials. So on the B, participants should already expect that they don't need to respond when they see the orange. So this is an indicator of good proactive control. Whereas on the AY, we expect somebody who's got good proactive control to be more susceptible to making errors because the A will have primed them to making a motor response. So BX trials over AY trials gives a good indicator of proactive control. And what we see here is that only in the inhibition group do we see a significant change going from reactive to proactive control as a function of the training. We don't see any significant differences for either of the other groups. Now, what's interesting then is that this suggests that inhibition really does seem to be at the core of cognitive control, and also interesting because it appears to be malleable. We seem to be able to change this well with training, and it appears to transfer onto other cognitive functions, which are relatively closely related to what was trained. Now, this was helpful to have established this because we then went on to a much larger intervention study, trying to see whether this leads to other tangible changes and benefits in associated cognitive domains. So we gave participants pretty much the identical training, but we divided them into two training groups. One was an experimental training group. They trained cognitive control. It's the same as the inhibition group, and the other group just trained response speed. And what we wanted to address in this study was what the effect of an 8-week cognitive control training is on various outcome measures. And if we do see any changes, whether they hold up after a 1-year follow-up. We looked at this in 226 children with a mean age of around 9 years and the age range of 6 to 13 that were recruited from the Greater London area. And the basic way that this was structured is that we had a sort of considerably large assessment of cognitive skills and associated domains before the training, then an 8-week training with a follow-up immediately after, and then another follow-up a year later. The types of functions that we looked at before training, and obviously after training as well, was a really extensive task battery of executive functions, of decision-making, looking at prosocial decision-making, intertemporal choice and risky decision-making, mental health outcomes and academic achievement, as well as brain structure and brain function. And we did these at the immediate follow-up and the T2 follow-up. Now, unfortunately, sort of COVID happened around here, which is why we don't have any follow-up of the brain measures at T2. But we managed to pretty successfully move everything to online testing. So we're still able to get a vast swath of the behavioral measures, allowing us to really look at this question in depth. Now, my team is frantically working away analyzing these data, but today, one sort of snippet that I'm going to give you, and this is very preliminary, very, very early days, and it's also just a snippet. It's also just one feature of this very, very large battery of tests which we conducted, is on mental health outcomes. So there were 3 batteries which we gave them. One was the child and adolescent symptom inventory. The other was a strengths and difficulties questionnaire, and then an apathy evaluation scale. and these were filled out by the parents. And they were measured. So what I'll be presenting now is sort of effects of this training sort of while COVID was happening. So these indicators of mental health were measured before and after COVID-19 restrictions were implemented in the UK. And, even though COVID was, sort of unspeakably tragic to have happened, in our particular case, we're actually able to leverage this as a naturally occurring stressor and able to see whether our executive function training was able to lead to any buffering effects ultimately in some of these negative effects that a persistent stressor like COVID might have had on children in our study. Before I get to those studies, those data, I just sort of want to discuss perhaps a little bit more some of the background of the training itself and how well it worked. So here we see the number of attempted sessions per group by our children, which was around 20 for the experimental group and the control group. We also implemented some kind of a bonus game for our children, where the number of times, of percent of times that children self-select themselves to be doing a bonus game is an indicator of how motivated they are. This was identical between the two groups. The overall motivation, whenever we asked children how much they enjoyed the training, whether they felt they got better at the training, was also comparable between the two groups. And one feature which I thought was really interesting is that my prediction would have been that motivation overall should have gone down as the training progressed. It's that the children are doing this repeatedly, and obviously it doesn't get more interesting necessarily, but possibly a little bit less so. But what we see is that motivation actually increases over both groups over time, which seems to suggest, and we're still trying to unpick how motivation and performance on these tasks interact, but it does seem to suggest that the games were very, very well designed in terms of keeping children interested and engaged. Now, here are the training effects just over the different sessions of training. And what we see here is an SSRT. And overall, I think what's very nice to see is that pretty much the sort of almost all individuals, with a few exceptions, improved their inhibition as a function of the training. And here is the response speed group, where we also see that children got faster over the training sessions. So again, I think we're in a very nice position to actually interpret any meaningful change that we see as a function of these trainings, because of these sort of pretty equitable training effects on the core functions. So onto the training effects on apathy then. So what we see here is the time point before COVID and the time point after COVID. We have three plots, one looking at the total apathy score, one looking at the cognitive, and one looking at the emotional apathy score. In red is the experimental group, so our cognitive control training group, and in blue is the response speed, or the control training group. And what we see is that in sort of across these measures, there is a significant increase in apathy. So as COVID happened, as it unfolded, children became increasingly apathetic, and this is totally in line with other studies that have tracked children longitudinally before and during or after COVID, as a function of the restrictions, being stuck in a house, not being able to see friends, and the monotony and boredom of being in that situation. So we saw an increase in apathy on the total score, as well as on the cognitive apathy measure. But one thing that's really interesting is that when we look at the emotional apathy measure, we see a significant increase only in our control training group, whereas for our cognitive control, our experimental training group, emotional apathy remains stable. And so it's as if our cognitive control training acted as some kind of a buffer in terms of preventing the emergence of emotional apathy as a function of COVID. So that's really, really encouraging finding. Now, just a quick interim summary before I move on to the next part. We've shown that it is indeed possible to train cognitive control and response speed. Inhibition training is more likely to transfer than training contextual monitoring. Apathy increased when measured before and after COVID-19 restrictions, and training cognitive control seemed to buffer the effects of COVID on apathy, particularly emotional aspects of apathy. Now, this, I guess it is, we were glad to see this. It's not entirely surprising because there is a strong link between cognitive control and apathy. So it's been shown that there might potentially be overlapping brain networks, including the dorsal striatum. And as I've mentioned before, cognitive control is absolutely crucial for pursuing goals, or rather having particular goals is absolutely crucial for harnessing resources such as cognitive control. So in that sense, I think having established this link and also showing that this sort of is directly applicable in very real life contexts is quite striking. Now, the next steps include trying to understand the mediating brain mechanisms, which we can do, looking at the longevity of training-induced change, but also obviously trying to understand the extent of plasticity and transfer. I think we must all appreciate that this is just one particular measure that we looked at here. We've got huge amounts of other data, not just mental health, but also other training domains. And we need to understand this in the broader context and obviously correct for the vast number of comparisons which we're making here. We're also trying to understand individual and age-related differences. And I think one aspect that is often overlooked, possibly, in the context of training studies is to see at which point the absence of an effect is meaningful. We have a pretty large sample of children, and I think that'll allow us to map out really what exactly the opportunities and also limits of cognitive control training might be. So I think just linking this back to the title of the talk, I think this sort of, I guess I've presented more on the opportunities, but really I think we must also acknowledge that there are going to be meaningful limits, which we are now going to explore as part of the wider work that's happening in my lab. Just take a quick break. So the second part, which is just one single study that I want to present, is sort of delving a little bit deeper into the examining the nature of the relationship between cognitive control and goal pursuit. So as I've mentioned repeatedly during this talk, I think there's sort of now a very solid evidence base and also really persuasive theories that cognitive control is deployed to attain particular goals. And as a result, the deployment of cognitive control is highly, highly sensitive to the associated costs. So how effortful is something going to be, and the associated benefits of the goal that is being attained. Which means that's, we can try and understand cognitive control within a very powerful framework, namely a reinforcement learning framework. The cost of cognitive control is sort of argued to arise from different levels. On the one hand, there are sort of intrinsic processing costs due to the information processing limits of our cognitive system. There are opportunity costs, which are very real. So if I'm attending to one particular situation or task, I'm not going to be able to attend to other problems. So this must be weighed up very, very carefully. And it's been argued that this sort of inherent aversiveness to cognitive effort and engaging in cognitive control acts as a value signal, which helps us to prioritize particular goals and how we want to deploy limited resources for the cognitive control to be able to achieve our goals. Now, the goals offset the costs, and there's some really lovely, elegant paradigms showing that the use of incentives, the use of rewards can improve cognitive control performance. But we know very, very little about how goals change over development. So typically, we use rewards and monetary rewards, but there are a lot of assumptions that are being made. So this next study, which I'm going to be talking about, tries to delve a little bit deeper into testing these assumptions of whether monetary rewards are actually sort of a meaningful way to chart the development of how goals influence cognitive control. Now, this is work that has been carried out by Sebastian Veselic, a PhD student in my lab, trying to understand the value and impact of different rewards across development. So it's been shown that rewards invigorate cognitive control across development. But But developmental studies on value-based decision-making, they typically assume that rewards have the same meaning for different populations. And the kind of rewards that are usually used and have been used in the past is money or monetary units. But how money is valued is very, very likely to change considerably through development. Could either increase in value due to its acquired value, sort of, as we mature, as we get increasingly acquainted to the power of money and what it enables us to do, that we could sort of associate the value of money with what it provides. But it could also decrease due to familiarity. So we've sort of got two competing hypotheses here in terms of what might be happening. But what takes place most in these studies, that the effects that we see are taken at face value. So say, we look at temporal discounting. Children tend to discount rewards over time much more steeply than adults, which is being taken as an indicator, and we don't really take into account that the values or the rewards that are being used to operationalize this may have a differential impact. So it could just be much more about the specificity of the rewards than the actual cognitive operations that these tasks purport to test. This has implications for a host of domains. So on the one hand, decision-making, using rewards, but also cognitive control. Now, we hypothesize that primary rewards like pleasant tastes and smells might be much less affected. So the capacity for sensing postnatal flavors begins in utero, and systems are functionally mature and adult-like by the end of gestation. Here's a picture of my two children enjoying some home-baked chocolate muffins, and here's my daughter enjoying it very much, and my son has already polished off his. I think this is just something that you've noticed very, very quickly, very easily, to sort of how attuned young children are to primary rewards such as pleasant tastes and smells. So what we looked at in this particular study is how the value of primary rewards and secondary rewards and its impact on cognitive control change over development. So we compared the valuation of a primary reward, which was juice, and a secondary reward, which was money, between children and adults. We introduced these two reward types. One was juice, which was the favorite out of three, and the other was money. Adults were paid out with real currency, and children were paid out in a lab currency to exchange for a toy. So, that was used to keep agency constant, but we appreciate there are some sort of differences there and how that was done. And we looked at this across three paradigms. So one was subjective valuation. So how much did participants say that they explicitly valued juice or money? We looked at how willing they were to work for either juice or money, and we looked at the effects of juice and money on cognitive control. We hypothesized that we probably would see developmental changes in how monetary rewards are processed relative to how primary rewards are processed, but we weren't quite clear what the direction of these effects were. So here's the explicit valuation paradigm. Participants were given, shown a visual depiction of the reward, and they were asked how much they wanted to receive this. The willingness to work paradigm, we gave our participants a cognitive task, which was particularly challenging, and they had to engage in making a decision whether they wanted to, how much they wanted to expend cognitive effort to gain either of these two rewards. And for the cognitive control paradigm, we looked at a flanker task, an inhibition task, and wanted to see whether the presentation of money or juice affected the performance and whether this was differential between the two groups. Now, what we see here is the explicit valuations. So how much did our participants say that they explicitly wanted or liked this reward? So here on the y-axis, we have the subjective value. Here's the primary, so this is the juice, and here's the secondary reward. And here are the adults, and here are the children. And what you see immediately is that for adults, adults explicitly say that they value money more than they value juice, whereas for children, this appears to be equal. When we look at our participants' willingness to work, so this is a discounting curve, and a lower number indicates a greater willingness to work. What we see is that adults are more willing to work for money than for juice, whereas we see no differences for the children. And when we look at cognitive control performance between children and adults, we see that money has a more profound effect on cognitive control compared to juice, whereas there's no difference for the children. So this is a really, really striking pattern, because we see this across three very, very different paradigms, that the effects are meaningful in one direction, and that money has a much more invigorating effect on performance for adults. So adults are just much more motivated to obtain money than children. And as a result, this should make us much more cautious when interpreting findings that have used monetary rewards to understand any developmental change in terms of decision making, but also in terms of the use of cognitive control to achieve particular goals. So this is the interim summary and already the conclusions. So children's deployment of cognitive control is sensitive to the nature and specific type of the reward. So the impact of reward type on cognitive control appears to change with age. So that the use of money is just much more effective for adults than it is for children. And goals obviously have a profound impact on the deployment of cognitive control, but we know very little about ecological goal development and how we might be able to leverage this knowledge in terms of operationalizing this for the kind of studies and phenomena that we're interested in. But sort of we're beginning to embrace in our lab just the fact that children have different goals to adults, and that when we try and run these particular studies looking at developmental change, that we need to acknowledge that explicitly and also leverage these insights in making paradigms not too much centered on how adults would see it, but also on how children might appreciate it. So in conclusion then, cognitive control is highly and very specifically plastic, and it appears to transfer to other domains, such as stressor-related apathy or buffering apathy in response to environmental stressors. And it's very, very strongly impacted by rewards and the nature of rewards, which in turn changes over development. So that suggests that cognitive control is a highly dynamic and context or goal-dependent process. And in terms of the next steps of what we endeavor to do in our lab is we want to understand the extent of transfer. We want to understand the nature of sensitive periods potentially and associated neural systems by understanding age effects and how this might account for whether and how our training transfers. And we want to sort of leverage the insights from previous studies in identifying age appropriate goals and seeing whether we can design our studies in more developmentally appropriate ways. So before I come to the thank you, here's a shameless plug. If you're interested in brain development and hearing, sort of lots of exciting talks and seeing posters, here's just a plug for the Flux Virtual Congress. I forgot to put a month here, but it's taking place in September, 17th to the 21st of September. It's online. I'm very honored to be head of the program committee, and we've really put together a very sort of fantastic program, and I highly recommend you to attend. So that brings me to the end of my talk, and I want to thank all the wonderful, wonderful people in my lab. Here's a pre-pandemic, here's mid-pandemic. They've all done phenomenally well in bearing with the stresses that have resulted. Want to thank my funders and you for your attention.
Wow, thank you so much. That was incredible. I will start moderating questions. So if anybody has questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. And yeah, when we can get started whenever. We have a question from James Booth. What is the relationship between cognitive control and the nature of knowledge? Does inhibition lead to greater specialization of representations, or does the development of specialization lead to better inhibition, or vice versa? Are these processes independent? Any thoughts that you can share on the relation between executive function and specialization is welcome.
That's a fantastic question. That's a really tricky question as well, if I'm honest. Specialization of representations. I mean, I think we probably need to have a thorough discussion of what exactly it is that we mean by representation itself. I mean, I think this speaks to a debate that takes place more broadly in the field of cognitive training, which is whether we're training particular strategies or whether we're training more sort of domain general processes. And there are different reasons for why one might be trained over the other. I think, strategy training is it's probably quite easy to illustrate in the context of a working memory task, but in the context of an inhibition task, for instance, a strategy would be, it's called strategic slowing, that participants just sort of deliberately get slower as they try to monitor for stop signals. So that would be a particular strategy. And as a result, the training in a particular strategy, it's been argued to be more specifically tied to the type and nature of a stimuli and sort of much less applicable to broader contexts. Whereas, and the reason why that would happen is depending on how these trainings are set up. So, one feature that we try to really capitalize on by gamifying our training is to make it very broadly applicable, to make it very variable. I mean, it all took place on the computer, obviously, and it was still taking place within the same world, but sort of with a few sort of levers that we had to try and introduce as much variability there as possible, which as a result, we think would have led to training more of a domain general process, and as a result leads to a broader set of a transfer across different functions. I'm not 100% sure if this really speaks to what you mean by representation and what you mean by specialization, but I think the more you allow a training and sort of the performance of a task to be successfully completed by using a strategy, I think the more specialized its use is going to be.
We have some more questions in the chat. So are you finding better results with the working memory training because inhibition is more important, or just because you think your game is great?
But obviously because our game is great. I think, yeah, again, I mean, obviously we'd need to do this in a really systematic way and also not overlook the fact that we might be comparing apples and oranges. I think there are several answers to this. I mean, I think it probably has helped that we sort of really trying to leverage a lot of insights from all the prior work in terms of what to do and what not to do when implementing this training. But having said that, many of the working memory trainings are also hugely engaging. I mean, if you look at CogMed, for instance, it's incredibly well done and very, very sophisticated. I think one feature that's probably overlooked, or that's not trivial at all, is what exactly the training mechanism is. So, in working memory trainings, it's about the span more often than not. It's just increasing the span, and then the assumption is that if we increase the span, then we're able to do, we're going to be better at associated functions. But there are many aspects to working memory, which isn't just about the amount of information which we're holding in mind. It's also about what we do with that information and how we manipulate that information. So it might be that what sort of crucially explains the relationship between working memory capacity and IQ or attainment isn't necessarily the items that we keep in mind, but more how we manipulate this, which could be something that's just not trained very well by these types of trainings. This is a working hypothesis, which is probably quite hard to really pursue in a lot of detail because of a problem that's well known in the literature, and that's, I think, is sort of really apparent in the training literature, which is called task impurity. We're just dealing with tasks which, they bundle a lot of cognitive functions, and we're very likely never going to be able to have a task which is just about number of items and a task which is just about manipulation. we can vary it to certain degrees, but that might still not give us enough traction on what's going on. This is a really long-winded answer to get me to the point of, I think, there is a possibility of, us having nailed it with a stop signal delay in terms of inhibition. I think, our study is very nicely set up now to, just to kind of feed this back into the title, to really look at the opportunities and limits of cognitive control training, because we'll sort of be able to map out across these domains and brain measures how effective the training has been, really. So, I think it's encouraging that we managed to find something looking at apathy, but we need to see just sort of really A, how it holds, and B, how reliable it is also vis-a-vis to other cognitive functions.
We have some more questions in the chat. So in regards to your second experiment for cognitive control and goal pursuit, why use the same rewards for both children and adults? Consider children and adults have different value on juice and money. Would the rewards impact the own preference selection?
Right. Yeah. I think that was the point, really, of the study. I think so. What we wanted to do, our assumption was that primary rewards would probably be processed in a relatively in a way that's more similar between children and adults than secondary rewards. And for a range of different reasons, we weren't quite sure which direction that was going to be. And our hypothesis was confirmed in that adults really did seem to make a much stronger difference between primary and secondary rewards than children did. So I think that was a first step, as it were, in terms of showing that using money is probably a suboptimal way of trying to understand the effect of incentives on cognitive control, or sort of using that for goal setting in the context of lab experiments. And that what we now need to do is just really embrace that difference, that there are going to be differences in terms of goal processing between children and adults, and that we need to understand those goals and think about ways of leveraging that information to design studies that are more optimally titrated to each age group, as opposed to making them comparable, but always biasing them towards adults.
Another good question is, what do you consider to be the importance of efficacy, or the importance or efficacy of your trainings for classroom academic outcomes?
I consider the importance. Yeah, and we're looking at academic outcomes now, and hopefully we'll be. That sort of given the literature of these associations between cognitive control or executive functions and academic outcomes, and also how predictive they are, we would be hopeful that indeed this is something that we can also demonstrate. And we have the data, so this is something that we'll be able to look at and hopefully report back on that very soon.
In your first training study, you used the stop signal task, which is often considered as a measure of response inhibition. Do you think your conclusions about transfer of inhibition are specific to response inhibition, or that these are also applied to other forms of inhibition, like suppression of distracting stimuli?
So I think that's a fantastic question. Thank you. I think this is I think given the way the training was set up, we're optimistic that this would extend to other forms of inhibition. And I say this because we sort of try to avoid our participants learning excessively that to inhibit their response is to do with a particular stimulus. I appreciate that it's in the motor domain, and we're also interested in trying to see where this extends to other domains. Again, I think similar to the previous question, we have the data to try and see whether this extends to other forms of inhibition as well. Given how the training was set up, I'm hopeful that we'll also see some transfer effects on other forms of inhibition.
In the longitudinal cognitive control training study, do you think that the increase in motivation you saw that went against your expectations could have partially been tied to the contextual effects of COVID boredom, so that despite increased apathy, the kids may still have played and remained equally motivated?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. I like that interpretation, actually. I mean, it's hard to say because, you know, because we don't really know what's going on in these kids' homes. I mean, you know, I have a 6-year-old, and you know, we had to homeschool, and there's a lot of online learning going on, and you know, my hunch would be that they'd probably be sick of doing more stuff on their computer than not. So, I mean, you know, one thing that we're going to try and explore now is, because we have these sort of relatively fine-grained resolution of improvements in our training function over the sessions and the motivation questions, is to look at the interplay in how sort of self-efficacious children felt they became in performing this task, and how that fed into how motivated they were. So, you know, we can really look at this in a very nice and fine-grained way, a sort of a cross-lagged design, effectively, by actually treating the performance on these tasks as actual data, and looking at how, you know, motivation might predict performance, but also how performance might predict motivation.
These have all been really great questions. I'm gonna give us about a minute left if anyone has any lingering questions or thoughts they want to share, and then we can switch to Aiden's presentation. Thank you so much, Niko. That was absolutely awesome. Really, really, really interesting stuff. And yeah, that was awesome. So a virtual round of applause for you. And
thanks so much. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I'll quickly introduce Aideen Slattery, who is one of the winners of the research pitch competition. And Aideen, when you're ready, you can share and present your video.
Hi everyone, thanks Anna for the introduction, and thanks to Dr. Steinbeis for such an interesting, fascinating talk. So as Anna said, my name is Aideen Slattery, and I am a PhD student, final year PhD student at the University of Limerick in Ireland. And my PhD looks at cognitive attention training for improving sustained attention in children. And my video will present one of my PhD studies. So I'm not going to say anything else. I hope my video will do the talking, and I'm going to share my screen. So please let me know if there's any issues once I hit play. Okay, so that is my video. I am going to stop sharing my screen now, and I look forward to receiving any questions you may have.
Yeah, thank you so much. Any questions would be great. I'm going to start off with a question. Again, thank you for sharing. That was really interesting and great research. And I love your presentation. I feel like it was really engaging and entertaining. So kudos to you. I think this was a really interesting talk to have right after Niko's talk. And I would just like to hear you talk a little bit about how maybe a gamified or training type of intervention might produce different results when it comes to like sustained attention and cognitive control compared to the intervention you used.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It is possible that if the training program was computerized, we would have seen improvements in sustained attention potentially. I think maybe because, well, like I think a big thing driving that would be that our assessments of sustained attention are also computerized, so very similar and potentially in terms of training and assessment for the sustained attention, potentially. But yeah, it is different. The non-computerized intervention, and you don't really see a lot of interventions that are not computerized these days. But I think we wanted something that was low cost, easily implementable in schools. You know, a lot of schools in Ireland, you know, they don't have many computers even, like they do have computers, but you know, they're not like readily available. So yeah, that was our thoughts behind the non-computerized intervention.
Very cool. Great. We have some other questions in the chat. So just to clarify, did you use any standardized tests for working memory in the study?
Yes, we used the digit span backwards subtest, the WISC, and we also used a symmetry span test and an operation span test as our working memory capacity measures. So yeah, I think that answers that one.
Where can we read more about this? Curious about why you wanted to emphasize them winning in the training program.
Because it's a game, and we want them to have fun and enjoy it, and winning is part of the game. So we thought that was an important, you know, it wasn't overemphasized, you know, but it was, you know, try your best, try to win, have fun. We didn't overemphasize it, but I guess, you know, winning is part of any gameplay, really. So I think that might answer that question.
Was the game played in a silent room without other distractions?
Yes, so the game was played in a separate room. So I was the researcher, obviously, and then the 3 students who played the game. So it was just the 4 of us in a separate room.
Do you think the attention wasn't sustained because although they had to pay attention to score after 5 minutes, they no longer had to concentrate so hard as they would change over and someone else would keep the score?
So even the scorekeeper was, you know, was required to keep score. So after every 5 minutes, the kids stopped, and we had like little score cards, and they'd write down the score they were holding in their mind. So I'm not sure that answers that question, but even I think it might target the scorekeeper. But all 3 kids then had to, you know, keep score and then write it down after. And then, you know, they revealed the score and I revealed the true score, and they were like, oh, we're so close, or we're not so close. So I think kids were motivated. We also measured the kids in the training group, their level of motivation and engagement, and they were trying to keep score and were motivated, or so they reported in a self-report measure after training. Any other questions?
Well, if that's all the questions, we can conclude today's virtual conference series session. Thank you all for attending. And just another reminder, the next virtual conference series session will be Wednesday, July 28th, on the socioeconomic inequality and children's brain development given by Kim Noble. And once again, we're looking forward to seeing you all in person next summer in Montreal. Virtual round of applause for Dr. Steinbeis and Aideen. Thank you, everybody.